All right. Our second topic today. We recently saw that Alexei Navalny died. Many believe he was killed, but he died in a gulag in Siberia, in Russia. He was in custody because, what many say, was basically speaking out against the government and Russia. And we wanted to comment on that, but also just in the context of the United States and the concept of free speech, which is often thrown around. Right now, even the U.S. Supreme Court is dealing with a case where the question of free speech and government restriction of speech on social media versus social media companies' restrictions on speech, and whether that constitutes the government acting or whatever. So just the concept of free speech and how that's built into our country, something we may take for granted, something we may misunderstood, but just your reaction to Navalny and what happened with him, and then also in the context of what our principle and concept of free speech is in the United States.
Yeah, I think we're probably at this point a little late to the party. We're not going to be the first people talking about Navalny's death, but I do think like I've seen just many other pundits and read in articles and things. I think it's very symbolic. I've heard comparisons to Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. Leaders of the last 100 years or within living memory for many. Who tried to bring justice to the people of their nation against an authoritarian regime, or at least, an authoritarian system, if we say, let's say, Jim Crow in the United States. So, it's one of those, and I think it's glaring just because of this continued type of activity that appears to come from the Russian government in terms of how the fate of its political opponents and foes. And in contrast, let's say for example, how we deal with political dissent and politicians in the United States deal with political foes. So I do think it's relevant, and it appears to be just another notch on the belt of a long arc of this direction by the current Russian government.
Yeah. Well said. I mean, like you said, this has been discussed extensively, looking at it from the lens of Russia. I was actually more interested in the lens of the United States because oftentimes we see, I think the concept of freedom of speech in the United States, at least amongst rank and file Americans, is, I don't know that it's understood completely. It's definitely taken for granted. And I say that because you'll see people citing free speech or complaining about free speech if they get, let's say, banned from Twitter or something like that. And that's not what Navalny went through. Like, his issue wasn't that he got banned from social media or that he lost the job. Like he was working somewhere and then he came out and spoke against the government and then he lost his job, or he protested something and lost his job. Like, this man was imprisoned and lost his life for speaking out. And the concept of freedom of speech at its core deals with that. It deals with the ability to speak out against the government. If you're like, one of the key things about free speech is that you don't need freedom of speech to say things that are acceptable or popular or the current kind of status quo. If Navalny was saying the Russian government is great and, I just want to do anything to support the Russian government, they never tell lies. He wouldn't need freedom of speech. He can say that as much as he wants because that's the message that regime wants out. The issue was that he was saying things that the regime did not want out, and they don't have the concept of freedom of speech to where you're allowed to say that stuff without criminal penalties and without being put in jail, locked up, all that kind of stuff. So in the United States, that's what we have. Like, you don't see someone standing up against the government with words, saying, hey, I disagree with what the government's saying, or the government's not telling you the truth, and dealing with that by going to jail. And so that's what the freedom of speech is that we have. And that's what we need to value. The concept that there should be no repercussions for anything anyone says, no commercial repercussions, no benefits that a private company may give people that it could take away, to me is preposterous. And it's an insult to the people who have, whether it be Navalny or other people who have spoken out against regimes and then paid for it with their life, or, in the case of Mandela, just losing 30 years of their life, or whatever. So to me, I think that's what we have to, we have to take example or use examples of this in the real world and have an appreciation for what we have here in the United States when it comes to something like free speech.
Yeah, and I think that's well said. One thing that kills me is I went and looked at the First Amendment as a good reminder of how fortunate we are. I mean, that's what I mean. It's interesting these moments contrast, and it really hurts me to see in the United States, it's like you're alluding to, this false equivalency.
Yeah.
That not only some Americans don't understand, like you're well put, the concept of freedom of speech is really to protect us from the government coming down on us if we were to dissent. Remember, the freedom of speech goes many ways, right? A corporation has the freedom to say they don't want certain customers if they're not behaving in a way that is conducive to the environment. So just like if I'm in a bar and I drink a bit too much, I mean, James, I've joked with you about binge watching Cops and Karen videos. A lot of them, if you just go look at them, are people that just drank too much at an airport or bar, and they're rowdy. And the patron of the owner of the establishment is just telling the cops, I can't have this person here. They're just disrupting the environment, and they have a right to not let that person in. So to your point, on social media, if you own a private company and you have people on your platform that are saying things that are against your standards and that have been in writing that people clicked on when they signed the terms of agreement, you have a right to ban them. That doesn't mean the government has a right to treat political dissidents like they do in Russia. And I think that's where, to me, the false equivalence is very dangerous, because here in the United States, because we have people and, from a former president who's aspiring to be president again to people in the Congress and the Senate who say that people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th are the same as Alexei Navalny. They forget to mention that those people broke the law, trespassed, and broke windows. They didn't just sit there and peacefully assemble like they did in the morning of January 6th on the Ellipse when former President Trump
the people that were just out talking stuff aren't the ones that are getting criminal penalties. It's the people that vandalized and broke in and then started committing, like other crimes. And that's actually, see, to me, one thing that there is a difference between being someone who speaks out against the government and also committing crimes versus someone who speaks out against the government and then the government trying to find something to charge you with, or trumping up something to try to charge you with. And that can be a distinction that can be a thin line sometimes that is hard to distinguish from the outside. But some of that we just have to use common sense. Like if someone is going around and committing crimes unrelated to them speaking out against the government, then a lot of times we can surmise that, okay, well, maybe this person is a criminal who also happens to be speaking out against the government. But speaking out against the government doesn't mean that your other criminal activity is acceptable. You still the government can go after you for that other criminal activity. But the idea or the act of speaking out against the government itself can't be made a crime. Or, in the United States, an example of the government coming down against someone for exercising political speech, disagreeing with the government. The most recent example of that actually would be the government of Florida and Ron DeSantis deciding to try to make Disney's life very unpleasant, using regulations, doing all types of machinations to retaliate against Disney because they didn't like that Disney made their displeasure known of some of the things that the government of Florida was doing. That's the kind of protection that freedom of speech is supposed to give you. And so I think now an issue that's before the U.S. Supreme Court right now is a pretty interesting as well. I'm not going to bore you from a legal context, but just basically the issue there is that the state of Florida and also Texas created laws saying that the social media companies have to are not allowed to ban people because they say things that violate their terms and conditions. And what's interesting about that is that the question before the Supreme Court is that, well, can the government make companies allow people to do whatever speech they want on their platform? And so that's yet to be decided. That's an issue that we're about to see. It appears as if it's going to be something, again, the government needs to stay out of it altogether. If a private company wants to say, you can do this and these are the terms of conditions of using my establishment, you have to wear pants, or you can't say this, you can't say crazy stuff here, you can't insult these people. Which, of course, I don't think anybody would say that if a restaurant instituted that type of policy that oh no, you got to let these people in that go around, insulting people everywhere they go. That I don't know that people would have the same reaction, but nonetheless, this is an issue that's still evolving in the United States, and that we're still asking different questions in terms of what's allowed and what's not in their freedom of speech. But again, something like this, beyond noting it and saying, okay, yes, it's unfortunate, it's terrible what happened to this guy. It's also a time to reflect and look back at what we have in our country and to appreciate it and maybe to understand it a little better and understand what makes it special and make sure that we deny the false equivalency and protect it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you landed there, because that's where I want to keep going, is really the false equivalency. You're right. We don't appreciate, think about it. We have entire economic ecosystems in this country that are built on dissent to the government. Yeah. I mean, I'm a boater in South Florida. If you go on the water here in South Florida, there's a million flags that say F Biden, let's go Brandon, all that stuff. And I'm not saying that because I'm upset about it. I'm just saying that there's no flag you're going to find flying publicly in Russia saying F Putin.
Yeah.
You know, the ability, I don't like if someone burns the American flag. I'll find that offensive. But the Supreme Court said that we have a right to dissent in America. Burning the flag is part of free speech. So that's the thing that comes along with being in a free country, is that we got to accept that we got to deal with things that we might not like. A lot of people have an issue with transgender people having freedom of speech, or blacks, or gays, whoever, right?
Well,
but everyone gets it right.
Broadly, a lot of people have a problem with people exercising free speech when they don't agree with what the person is saying. And that blows the whole point.
Which is the whole point. So
I think we can wrap from there. We appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
And I am a corporation today.
All right. We'll talk to you next time.